Hi, this is David Bose, Washington Policy Center Communications Director. The Department of Education is on the chopping block and is in the sights of President Donald Trump. The question we have before us is, does it matter? Would it hurt the education of the nation's children if the Department of Education went away? And what would the impact be? Well, our own Dr. Vicki Murray is with us. She literally wrote a book on the subject, Failure, the Federal Miseducation of America's Children, that tackled some of these very questions. Um, Dr. Murray, the Department of Education was originally set to accomplish certain goals. What were they, and did they actually accomplish any of these things?
Well, there were four major goals. One of them was reducing duplication of federal education programming, streamlining minimizing bureaucracy, getting economies of scale. But the most important one was really improving student learning, particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So it's really the fourth goal that I think is the most important: improving student learning.
And when since the inception of the Department of Education, has that improvement of student learning taken place?
No, at best, the scores are pretty flat across grade level subjects and for various student subgroups. So if you want to get a nice visual, think of just a flat line. There'll be a few peaks and valleys, from 1980 when the doors of Department of Ed opened to today. But what you really see is we've got this going on, but then in terms of spending, it just goes literally off the charts. In fact, Department of Education spending is now approaching $270 billion. And we really have very little to show for it in terms of improved student outcomes.
So, when we're talking about resources being finite, I know the federal government prints their own money, but even they seem to be coming to some kind of conclusion that there's only so much debt you can print before severe consequences and the laws, not the suggestions of economics, but the laws of economics apply. That if you're spending more and getting the same or less, then that's not a great investment. And so what would you say to those who are kind of panicked, like the idea that the end of the Department of Education is the end of education, or it's going to dramatically hurt the children of Washington State, for example?
Well, I would say first take a breath. We lived before Department of Education. We're going to live well, and I would say better after it. Here's the reality. I think I'm glad you brought up laws of economics, starting with the basics, Economics 101. We often hear policy debates and federal dollars discussed as though there's some magical, mystical dollars out there that the federal government creates, as if Congress goes back into some sort of money orchard, shakes the trees, and comes up with new money. I think we have to keep in mind that every federal education dollar is a tax dollar that we earned. The only thing that will be changing substantively without a Department of Education is we eliminate a very expensive, inefficient, and ineffective middleman. So rather than funneling taxpayer dollars all the way across the country to Washington, D.C., and then have really a nickel on the dollar coming back with a lot of expensive red tape and strings attached, why don't we just keep the money here at home where we're better situated to know what our students need and what works best?
That brings me to, how would if the Department of Education were to be abolished, how would you break it down? Or is there anything that you would preserve, and what would you do if that meeting, what would you do if you were to break down the Department of Education? How would you divide it up? Is there anything you'd preserve?
Well, there are actually constitutional components within the department that I would absolutely preserve. First and foremost, the Office for Civil Rights. That is constitutionally sanctioned. I would just move that office over into the Department of Justice. Other programs, for example, like Veterans Affairs, Veterans Education programs, move those to Veterans Affairs. Something like higher education and all the loans and the grants and all the money, that's one of the most expensive components administered by the Department of Education. Just privatize that. The federal government is not a bank. It shouldn't be in the lending business. There are all kinds of perverse incentives to not look out for the borrower, not make sure the taxpayer dollars are well spent and well invested. So I think that should be completely privatized, because just the proof is in the pudding. How many students are left with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt under the federal government's watch? I think we can do a lot better. So those are the programs some of the programs I would keep.
If let's say you did that, and we managed to put civil rights in with the Department of Justice, preserve the education statistics, so that in the Census Department,
Right.
student loan programs, what would happen to them? A lot of people might say, I know you say we shouldn't be in the business, but people might say, well, where are the students going to get the money? What's going to happen? How are they going to go to college?
Well, I think one of the first, whatever agreements were made, we honor, but going forward, I mean, once government comes into any sort of sphere, it seems to crowd out most innovation, other sorts of creative lending. One idea would be, for example, we need more engineers, say. You want really great engineers who have a strong, math, science background, really good at what they do. Well, why can't we have businesses enter into contracts with undergraduates and say, hey, these are programs that, really work, and we will pay for your college in return. You come work for our company for X number of years. So you can have all sorts of private contracts. And then with, private banks, let's face it, I think it is fair to say that if you want to pursue a degree like, I don't know, 17th century dance theory, you're going to have to find nonprofits for whom that's a passion, and they want to make sure that that legacy is continued. Nonprofits could fund that. Banks and financial institutions, probably not so much. I don't know what the return on investment is for that. But there would be all sorts of different, whether apprenticeships, angel capitalists, venture capitalist lending situations, any
Well,
sort of,
and it would get people to
innovative.
look for online learning that's free. I mean, in some of these
Oh,
cases,
exactly.
we spent about what it seems like we spent at least a year talking about all these loan forgiveness because people were, being trapped into a false promise of spending all this money for degrees. And, I mean, I think your essential point is that the federal government is creating this incentive for people to get the quote unquote free money. And then they end up, with degrees that can't actually pay back that obligation. Right.
Exactly. Exactly. And look at, on the internet has created so many wonderful opportunities. And it's not just these cut and paste sort of opportunities. It really opens up the door to lifelong, you know, financially sensible, fiscally responsible learning options.
If what it boils down to it, if how would the end of the Department of Education, if somebody right now is saying, well, look, this is something that I've always, this is something that's needed. This shows a lack of priority for education. This is diminishing the prioritizing of education. What would your response be to those people? How should they look at an end to a federal department in terms of education priorities and whether or not children are still being a priority for public education?
I think the true measure of any effectiveness or priority is student learning. Hey, we've given the US Department of Education over 40 years. By the way, this time around, there was a Department of Education that was implemented in 1867. Within a year, it was downgraded, demoted, moved around, all sorts of things. The reality is, just because we spend more doesn't mean we care more. What we have to care about is whether children are learning, whether programs are working. There was actually an alternative plan to the US Department of Education back in the mid 70s and late 70s as Congress was having these debates. And it was very simple. Let's line up all the education programs throughout the federal government, and we see which ones are working and which ones aren't. Oh, no, 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 we couldn't possibly have that. If we were really serious about student learning, and that's what we should be focused on, that's the plan that would have happened. So I think now we have a really good opportunity within the states. Let's face it, every state has a state Department of Education. Just devolve those grants administer at the state, the state level, and they're already doing it. Let the existing grants run their course, and then tax all the money that we're not sending to Washington stays here in taxpayers' pockets. And then we vote on which education plans we think are going to work. And what's beautiful about Washington State is we're a local control state. So we're going to be able to really get down to the local level because Eastern and Western Washington are different. Their different communities are different. We can really tailor and direct our resources much more efficiently, and much more transparently.
It's an interesting thing to me with the polarization of politics to point out that at the federal level, if you're saying you want things to stay at the federal level and a Department of Education should handle the money and then give it back to the state, essentially you're saying, I want the Trump administration, I want the Trump administration priorities to decide what money comes back to the state and how, because it's a Trump administration cabinet official. And but if you go along with the idea of the Department of Education being abolished and the money going, staying with the states or going directly back to the people, then all of a sudden you're saying, I want my local officials and state elected officials to make these decisions rather than the federal government. So it's kind of a strange thing to have people arguing that are very angry with the Trump administration on the possibility of getting rid of this, in a way saying, no, we want you to decide what our priorities are instead of ourselves. That's kind of what it boils down to me.
That's an excellent point. And we have to remember that part of the issue with having any sort of concentration of power in government is that it makes it very easy for special interest groups to just converge on one place, and they have an inordinate amount of power in affecting policy. When we devolve that power and bring it back to local taxpayers, these same folks are still going to have power, but it's much more balanced because they have a voice at the table, but so does everybody else whose job it isn't just living in Washington and lobbying for certain political agendas. So I think it's going to really bring some much needed balance and effectiveness again in student learning.
And with the flat line of student learning, as you pointed out, if the department is abolished, the odds are that the flat line will stay the same because there wasn't much of a difference before or after. There's just the
No.
carrying charges. I'm sure there's much more. Your book, Failure, the Federal Miseducation of America's Children. We'll have to talk more in depth about that at another time, but I do appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you so much. It's my pleasure.